1962 was without question one of the most interesting years in American history. Stateside, we experienced the heightened tension of the Cuban Missile Crisis that left everybody a bit on edge. And in the automotive world, the official start of the muscle car era was just a few short years away, and the legendary American V8s were really starting to hit their strides by this point. Across the Atlantic, though, European automakers were busy designing two of the most beautiful cars that would ever be built, the E-Type Jaguar and the legendary Ferrari 250 GTO and GT Berlinetta SWB. In America, our halo sports car at the time was the C2 Corvette, which is an icon in its own right, but it lacked that exotic car flair that many people yearned for. Luckily, in California, there were three industrious young American gearheads that wanted to build their own exotic Grand Tourer to compete with a slew of other cars that came out of Europe. And through sheer will and determination, they were able to bring their creation to life. This is the story of that car, the incredibly rare and forgotten Apollo GT. But now, let's get into the story of how three seemingly normal guys from California would end up building a stunning Grand Tourer that would give the E-Type Jag a run for its money. The three men that would come together to build the Apollo GT were Milt Brown, Ron Plescia, and Ned Davis. The whole project really hinged around Milt Brown. Milt was a car guy since birth, who had always had ambitions of creating his own performance car. So much so that he was even working on building his own Class H race car long before the Apollo GT would be brought to life. Milt would go on to pursue a career designing race cars, and for part of his career, he would be overseas in Europe getting immersed in their sports car culture. It was while Milt was working in Europe where he would end up meeting a very important connection, Frank Reisner. See, Frank was the owner of Intermechanica, which at the time was still a small fledgling automaker. This connection, though, and the bond of common interest between the two men led Frank to agree to utilize his network of coach builders in Italy to build a body for whatever car that Milt would go on to create. And by 1962, Milt and his two friends, Ned and Ron, would create their company, International Motor Cars, which is unfortunately a pretty uninspiring name, but the car that they would build would not share that same uninspiring sentiment. Ron would draw the initial sketch of the Apollo GT and have that further designed by Franco Scaglione, who worked for the famous Italian design house Bertone. The final body design for the Apollo GT was gorgeous, but it was also a shape that was very familiar in a lot of ways. The rear of the car drew clear inspiration from the E-Type Jaguar, and the front was much more Ferrari looking. And if you were to just look at the front view of an Apollo GT and swap Ferrari badges onto it, I think you would actually have a really difficult time spotting that it's not actually a Ferrari. This gorgeous hand-formed steel body would be shaped by Intermechanica in Italy and then attached to a fully assembled roller chassis to then be shipped back stateside for the final drivetrain installation and finishing touches for the production cars, which would be available for purchase in late 1962. Like many of the low production cars of the day, the Apollo GT would utilize a relatively simple ladder frame chassis that easily accepted, in this case, a Buick front subframe and a 4-link independent rear suspension. And now you might be asking, why the Buick subframe? Well, part of the reason for the selection of the Buick subframe in particular was for the easy mating of the Apollo GT's engine of choice, the famous Buick 215 cubic inch V8. From the start, the Apollo GT was designed to have largely American running gear to help keep the maintenance and repair costs down, given the difficulty for getting parts into the US for a lot of European and exotic cars at the time. And this 215 cubic inch Buick V8 was an exceptional engine. For starters, it was also an all-aluminum engine, which meant that it only weighed a hair over 300 pounds, and it made around 200 horsepower. Pair this with a stout T10 4-speed manual transmission, and the Apollo GT was a lively GT car that still only weighed around 2,500 pounds. For those who wanted a less lively experience, you could also get an automatic, but I think everybody here watching this video would probably prefer the 4-speed. But let us know in the comments down below. The 215 Buick-equipped Apollo GTs would be known as the Apollo 3500 GT, as the displacement of this engine was 3.5 liters. These cars could do 0 to 60 in the mid 7-second range and were allegedly low to mid 15-second cars in the quarter mile. The Apollo GT was actually one of the first Italian-looking yet American-powered GT cars, and it was a fresh change to the market that would be soon duplicated multiple times over by other brands using a very similar formula. During the production run of the Apollo GT, International Motor Cars would also have to release a new version of the car called the 5000 GT to keep up with rising horsepower demands. This one featured a new Buick 300 cubic inch iron block V8. This engine was very similar to the initial 215, but it packed an extra 50 horsepower to help keep up with some of the faster offerings bursting onto the scene. With the Apollo 5000 GT cars, total output was 250 horsepower as opposed to the 200 horsepower from the 215 cars. However, the new 300 cubic inch motor was certainly heavier than the old one. The 5000 GT cars also got a few other upgrades like front disc brakes instead of the 4-wheel drum brakes that came standard on the earlier 3500 GTs. Apollo also released a handful of Spyders, which arguably looked even better than the hardtops, but as you'll soon find out, the Spyders are unbelievably rare. Which brings us to the end of the International Motor Cars and Apollo line altogether. Even though buyers really did like the Apollo GT at launch, the company always struggled with cash flow issues trying to actually get their inventory and vehicle production properly sorted, which by no means is an easy task. And by 1965, these cash flow issues had become extremely apparent. Constantly on the hunt for funding, the company even had to provide some of their Apollo GTs in the end to another company called Vanguard Industries, who would badge them as the Vetta Ventura and sell them that way. But unfortunately, that arrangement didn't last long for them either. And by the end of 1965, the Apollo GT officially bit the dust. In the end, production numbers are hard to exactly gauge, but allegedly 88 total cars were built, with 8 or 9 of them being the Spyders. And not all of these 88 cars survived. So today, these Apollo GTs are still exceptionally rare, but somehow they're still not unfathomably expensive. Hardtop versions of the 3500 GT and 5000 GT currently trade hands for around the $120,000 to $150,000 price point. And the convertibles, which are significantly rarer, go for around the $500,000 mark, which is definitely a lot of money, don't get me wrong. But compared to some of the similar looking Italian offerings of the time, specifically any 250 Ferrari, the Apollo GTs seem like an absolute bargain. The Apollo GTs look amazing, they're more reliable than their Italian counterparts, and most importantly, they have an amazing story behind them, which is more than worth the price of admission, which we thought made them worthy of an episode. But that is the end of the short story of the Apollo GT, America's forgotten Grand Tourer. If you enjoyed this video, we would greatly appreciate it if you could drop a like and also share this video with other enthusiasts. Also, please make sure that you are subscribed to the Rare Cars YouTube channel and smash that notification bell for more documentary style videos just like this on the world's most interesting cars. Until next time, enthusiasts.